Fratelli Tutti. And what we're going to do here, I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. You know, it's a big document, but I'm certainly not going to be reading all, 200 pages of it or whatever it is. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to give a run through what's in the document, how the Pope has analysed the problems in the world at the moment, and what the Pope is proposing that we do to try and rebuild, because it's very, very timely, this document. It can provide us almost with a manifesto for how we rebuild from the pandemic. I'd stress, obviously, I'm approaching this as a lay Catholic. I'm certainly no professional theologian. So if you want more information, there are far better sources than me. But this is very much based on my reflection on reading the document a few times in the last few weeks, since it was published on the 4th of October, St. Francis's feast day. So it's the stuff that stands out for me is my lived experience as a Catholic growing up in this country. I'm very, very conscious that others will have taken many different things from it, and would really encourage you to contribute those when we have a brief discussion at the end. Okay, so just if we can move to the next slide, Anita. Again, I know that my experience as a Catholic, you grow up, you go to mass, you take part in all sorts of activities in your parish, your RE lessons at school and everything. Catholic social teaching is not something that I was excessively familiar with growing up. It's something that we get lots of. We appreciate the values that they're inherent and they're implicit in a lot of things that we do. But it's not something that we speak about at great length in ordinary Catholic life. So this is, I fully appreciate a lot of people are very au fait with Catholic social teaching, have read extensively papal documents and everything. But this is just a bit of a heads up for anyone who isn't familiar with it. There's a really lovely book called Catholic Social Teaching, Our Best Kept Secret. And in some respects, that is a very succinct summary of what Catholic social teaching is. What it is in a nutshell is looking at the problems and the issues in society today through the lens of the gospel. Very much a case of what would Jesus do? What does Jesus teach us about responding to the issues in society today? And a lot of certainly not exclusively, but a lot of these are expanded upon in documents from popes, particularly since the late 19th century, a really radical document from Pope Leo XIII in 1891. Needless to say, I don't remember it coming out or anything, but that was a document which looked at the condition of primarily the working class people at the time, the abject poverty around the world caused by industrialization. And since then, popes have written on the issues facing us, whether it's the need for peace building, the need to make sure that everyone is treated with dignity, the need to participate in democracy, human rights, solidarity, standing alongside people, subsidiarity, which is the need for decisions to be made at the appropriate level rather than everything being centralized and decided from on top. And very, very crucially for CAFOD, care for creation, certainly since Pope Francis published Laudato Si in 2015. And the preferential option for the poor, how imperative it is to make sure that decisions are made based on the needs of the poorest members of society. So as I say, these documents are often expanded in, these thoughts are often expanded in documents called encyclicals. An encyclical is just a circular letter. It's a letter from the Pope to all of us as Catholics. Now, what is in this document? Fratelli Tutti. I think I'd sum it up just in the context of some documents that have come from the Pope previously. If we look at one document, Evangelii Gaudium, this was published towards the start of Pope Francis's papacy, and it provided a roadmap, a blueprint for what the Pope was going to base his papacy on. It brought up the issue of the throwaway culture. It was very critical of trickle-down economics, and a lot of people looked at it and said he's a Marxist. Particularly right-wing radio hosts in America, they denounced it. In fact, the Pope was just repeating Catholic teaching of 2,000 years, but as I say, looking at it through the prism of modern times. We then have Laudato Si in 2015, and I think for my money, that is one of the most important documents written thus far this century. in that the Pope analyses the way that our society, our economy, our way of life is causing such damage to our common home, the damage that we're doing to God's creation. And the reason why it's so important is because it was perfectly timed in the run-up to the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement later in 2015. There have been various documents and various messages from the Pope since, certainly on issues of migration, such a huge issue for Pope Francis, on the role of young people in building a better world, and also our personal call to sainthood, about how we are called to put our faith into action, where the Pope describes, for example, the Beatitudes as a Christian's ID card. Where does Fratelli Tutti sit in that? In many respects, it's a recapitulation. It's taking all of that stuff and putting it together, but it's also extremely timely. It's written in the midst of a pandemic, and it's written to say, we can't afford to go back to an old normal. We want to get back to normal, but we want a new normal. So that's what I want to focus on today, the issues that the Pope raises about how we can build that new normal. So in terms of what is in the document, I'm trying, as I say, it's difficult to summarize succinctly, but I'll do my very best if you can be patient with me. You'll see on the painting, on the cover of the Catholic Truth Society publication of the document, there's a painting of St. Francis giving his coat to a stranger on the road. And that's a very apposite choice for the cover of the document, because the example of St. Francis runs throughout the document, whether implicitly or explicitly. The Pope presents St. Francis 800 years on as a model of fraternity, as somebody who, even during the Crusades, the conflict between Christendom and Islam, went to visit the Sultan in Egypt, someone who didn't just restrict his love and his care for his neighbor to those within his own city walls. And that's something that the Pope encourages to do, to think beyond the walls that we build, either figuratively or literally in some respects. We've got to remember also the context in which the encyclical is being written. And again, Francis specifies that. He says that he considers the pandemic to be a watershed moment. And it's not just a case of us being in a fight against the coronavirus, but we are also in a fight against other viruses, inequality, poverty, racism, and how these cause so much injury to humanity. In the document, the Pope looks in depth at the parable of the Good Samaritan, and he proposes that we live our lives by the standard that Jesus sets out in that parable. And it's interesting because obviously in the presentation with Sam earlier, and certainly in my breakout room, we were talking about neighbours. We were talking about during the early stages of the pandemic, when we had the 8 o'clock clap for NHS workers, when we were supporting people who were self-isolating, we might have been speaking to neighbours who we'd never had the opportunity to speak to before, and it's encouraging, and we don't want to lose that. But Francis really, really expands on the concept of neighbour throughout the document. He says that in early Jewish teaching, neighbour was just considered as someone of one's own nation, but that expanded over time. And that's something that we also have to do. We can't just think of our neighbour as someone who's next door, or someone in our own town, our own country, our continent. Our neighbours are worldwide. He says, do unto others is a command universal in scope, embracing everyone on the basis of our shared humanity. So the Pope asks us to think about how the Good Samaritan would live our lives. As much as what would Jesus do, it'd be what would the Good Samaritan do? He asks us, think about the characters in the parable. You've got the robbers, you've got the passers-by, you've got the injured man, and you've got the Samaritan. Who do we identify with out of those characters? Who do we identify with? So the Pope says, the decision to include or exclude those lying wounded along the roadside can serve as a criterion for judging every economic, political, social, and religious project. The Pope is very much saying, when you think about how you operate, when you think about the decisions that you're making, think, how would the Good Samaritan choose to act in this instance? So that's the background. I would say it's very difficult to sum up, but if I were to say that there are 3 themes I've taken from reading the document, I would say 1 is openness to our neighbours, especially those who we might not consider and we might not conceive of as our neighbours. 2 is the need for a new type of politics. And 3 is building peace. It's about building encounter with others, rejecting conflict. Okay. So if we can move to the next slide, Anita, and then the slide after that, the question of why is a rebuild needed? And this isn't a rhetorical question. You know, I'm sure that we're all agreed that we all want to build a better world. But if we can do a bit on the doom and gloom stuff, chapter 3 of the document is actually called "Dark Clouds over a Closed World," and the Pope sets out what those dark clouds are. He talks about how we have, in particularly following the Second World War, there was a sense of greater togetherness. Countries that had been fighting together for millennia were coming together, they were working together. And certainly in other parts of the country, there's other parts of the world where countries have overthrown dictatorships. There was a sense of new freedom, of independence, of burgeoning democracy. But now, unfortunately, we see those ancient conflicts breaking out anew. And the Pope talks about how there's aggressive nationalism on the rise. Another cloud he specifies is the oppression and the exploitation from what he describes as a dominating financial sector. And globalization, which instead of serving the needs of everyone, sharing the goods of humanity around, means that there's often an imposition of one cultural model, an erasure of people's cultures, of people's histories, of people's stories. There's also polarization and extremism. We don't need convincing of that. We've seen it in our own country in recent years, people being up against one another and how dispiriting that is. Okay, Anita, can we move to the next slide, please? I've picked out a few lines in particular where the Pope reflects on the pandemic and how it brought us together temporarily. But the Pope warns us that togetherness risks disappearing again. We can't always live in a situation where we're dipping out of nipping into one another's houses all the time, or the 8 o'clock clap. But we don't want to lose that sense of that sense of togetherness that we had. So the Pope warns us to make sure we don't do that. The Pope says the pandemic forced us to recover our concern for everyone. It wasn't just a case of I'm only looking after number one. We realized how interdependent we are, how much we rely on one another. No man or woman is an island. So if I could quote the Pope, he says, "If only this immense sorrow may not prove useless, but enable us to take a step forward towards a new style of life. If only we rediscover once for all that we need one another, and that in this way, our human family can experience a rebirth with all its faces, all its hands, all its voices beyond the walls we have erected." I think we'd all say amen to that. So despite the doom and gloom, despite those dark clouds, if we move to the next slide, we'll see that the Pope says we need to have hope. We can't allow ourselves we can't resign to a world of doom and gloom. And Anita, again, if we can move to the next slide, something that I discussed. Sorry, I think we're just going back one slide, Anita, and another one if you could. Thank you. Sorry, that was my fault, forgetting which slides we had in order. The Pope specifies, how people served one another, and he mentions a number by name: doctors, nurses, pharmacists, supermarket workers, cleaning personnel, transport workers, volunteers, priests and religious. They're just some of the people who have risen to the challenge during the pandemic, who have been serving their fellow citizens, and how sometimes we've taken those people for granted. And this crisis has properly reminded us that that's something that we can't afford to do. We can't afford to take people for granted, and just how much we do rely upon one another. As the Pope says, they understood that no one is saved alone. I'm just going to read one paragraph, which I think is important in the context of remembering that things have been challenging, but the need to cling on to hope. The Pope says, "I invite everyone to renewed hope, for hope speaks to us of something deeply rooted in every human heart, independently of our circumstances and historical conditioning. Hope speaks to us of a thirst, an aspiration, a longing for a life of fulfillment, a desire to achieve great things, things that fill our heart and lift our spirits to lofty realities like truth, goodness, beauty, justice, and love. Hope is bold. It can look beyond personal convenience, the petty securities and compensations which limit our horizon, and it can open us to grand ideals that make life more beautiful and worthwhile. That's the gift that Pope promises us. So in that spirit, if we do move to the next slide, Anita, let's look at how the Pope proposes we make that hope a reality. You know, how does the Pope propose that we rebuild? What things can we take away from the document? Next slide, please, Anita. Again, I hope you'll forgive me for doing a disservice to the document by just saying, right, these are the three categories. Read the document. It is beautiful, and there's a lot in there that we can interrogate and really analyze our world against. But if I could propose three ways that I think the Pope suggests we can rebuild a better world, they are: creating an open world is one. That means that we need to build societies which integrate everyone. He notes about how we can have hidden exiles in society. It's not just people who are far away, thousands of miles away. It can be people who are very close to us, people in city centres, or even within our own families. We've got to be aware of those who are not integrated in society and make an effort to include them. That means that we need to think beyond our immediate world and think about our global community. And we as CAFOD have a critical role to play in this as well. You know, there's a lot of discussion happening in politics about building back better. And we need to make sure we do have that in our communities, in our country at large. But we also need to make sure that no one is left behind, that no one is beyond reach. Pope says, it matters little whether my neighbour was born in my country or elsewhere, because we all share responsibility for each other's development. And again, because migration is such an important theme for this Pope, he says we need to welcome those in need. We need to work to improve living conditions in people's own lands by refusing to exploit those countries and backing corrupt systems. We need to reject nationalism, isolationism, the building of walls. We've seen that in recent years, how much poison and how toxic that has been for our world. And we need countries to work together. The pandemic, we have not been doing that. We've had various initiatives, but there hasn't been a coordinated global response. And we've seen how people have suffered so unnecessarily as a result. Part of that is making sure that poorer countries have an effective voice in decision making, that it's not all just left to the rich and powerful. And there's so much in this document about the importance of people from different faiths working together. The image that came to mind for me was the photograph of Sister Chris. That's at the top of the slide there. That's a photo that we got when we were in Paris ahead of the climate talks in 2015. And we were just having a walk around the city when this gentleman came up to Sister Chris. And Sister Chris had her rosary beads hanging out of her pocket. And he came up to her and he said, you know, look, here are my prayer beads. And it was such a lovely, beautiful moment, the two of them embracing, you know, sharing that friendship and everything with complete strangers. That is the image that came to mind when I was reading that, and just how important it is that we do work with people of all faiths in building this better world. The second thing, the second proposal, is that we make sure that our societies, our institutions, whether it's government, whether it's ministries, departments, agencies, whatever it is, that their purpose, their overriding purpose, is the service of the common good. That means that they need to be built on a model of solidarity. And solidarity is more than what the Pope says, sporadic acts of generosity. It's systemic, it's systematic. It means thinking and acting in terms of community. And it means combating the structural causes of poverty, of inequality, of racism, of a lack of work. Why are people not able to make a living for themselves? Why do people live in abject housing? The third thing is to build a better politics. And again, I don't think anyone would reject this suggestion. And that means that we need to move away from liberalism, which in the technical sense of, you know, being excessively obsessed with just the individual at the expense of the wider community, or populism, which is, rather than being disinterested in things that matter to the poor, actually masquerades as being interested in things that matter to the poor, when in fact it capitalizes on fear and it serves the rich and the powerful. Importantly, It also means we need to be able to listen to each other, to find out why someone believes something, instead of just immediately denouncing them, criticizing them, refusing to engage with them. This, for me, is one of the most invaluable lessons the Pope can teach us. It talks about, in modern society, we have what he describes as the feverish exchange of opinions on social media. But in fact, they're not an exchange of opinions, they're parallel monologues. It's people talking past one another instead of people talking to one another. He says that the heroes of the future will be those who engage in dialogue. And we also need to think about the long-term common good. It's something that might be difficult for politicians to do when you're thinking in terms of electoral cycles. How many years are we out from the next election? Can I afford to make this tax rise or this tax cut or make this decision or introduce that policy? Because is that going to lose me votes in this constituency or that? The Pope says we need to think about 20, 30, 40, 100 years down the line, people who will follow us. It also means that we need that international cooperation we've spoken about. We need to work together as a world. What happens in one country affects our neighbours in another as well. So the Pope says it's an indispensable act of love to strive to organise and structure society so that one's neighbour will not find himself or herself in poverty. And he gives real life examples of that. He says it's an act of charity to help an elderly person cross a river. But it's also an act of charity for a politician to build a bridge so that person can do it by themselves. That's an act of charity. It's the same as if you give someone something to eat, someone who's hungry. That's indisputably an act of charity. That's indisputably something that we should do. But if a politician works to create jobs, to enable people to make their own living, that means that they can feed themselves. So next slide, please, Anita. The question is, what does success look like? Those are the ideas, those are the proposals. How do we know whether we're achieving them? Can we go to the next slide, please, Anita? Right, anyone who works in a modern workplace will be familiar with the term key performance indicators. They're almost criteria for success, metrics for being able to decide, am I doing a decent job or do I really need to book my ideas up and get things sorted out? The Pope almost presents us with KPIs, key performance indicators, but they're not as scary as you might see on a modern spreadsheet or the like. The Pope says, and in some respects he channels Saint Oscar Romero in doing this, he says what is important is not constantly achieving great results, because that's not always possible. Certainly in the breakout group that I was in, people were saying, it can feel overwhelming with the challenges we have, the scale of the problems we have. We can feel a sense of helplessness of where do I start? Well, we start by doing small things. We can all have a contribution. The Pope says, if I can help at least one person have a better life, that already justifies the offering of my life. That already makes life worth living for me. And I think that is, we need that reminder. We need to be reminded that we all have a part to play in helping one another and building a better world. And in terms of politics, he specifies what politicians should do in terms of judging their success. He says, politicians shouldn't be asking themselves questions like how many people endorsed me, how many people voted for me, how many people have a positive image. They need that in order to get into a position of authority, into office, no question about that. But if that is the limit of their ambition, then they're selling themselves short and they're doing everyone else a disservice. So instead, the Pope proposes these criteria for success. He says, we should ask ourselves, how much love did I put into my work? What did I do for the progress of our people? What mark did I leave on the life of society? What real bonds did I create? What positive forces did I unleash? How much social peace did I sow? What good did I achieve in the position that was entrusted to me? For me, we could send those to MPs. We could send them, have a little memoir on your green benches when you're making your speeches, when you're making decisions. Those should be the things that people judge themselves against, their criteria for success. So you'll be delighted to hear I'm going to keep quiet now and I'm going to ask people to provide their own contributions. But I propose that we leave this slide on the screen because I think that is such an important reminder for us. Those words there are empowering, they're reassuring, they're inspiring. Those are the lessons that I personally have drawn from reading this encyclical, the tips and the advice that we've got from the Holy Father about how we build a better world that we so wish to bring about. But I'd very much encourage people to offer their own reflections now. So well, I know we've got some, as we were saying earlier, if you'd like to ask a question, if you can stick your hand up in the participants tab,